Welcome back to the Mountain Takes. I'm Isaac. 2 stories today, 2 mountains, and 2 women who walked into this thinking their job title back home meant something up here. It didn't. What's strange is that neither of their deaths happened the way you'd expect. No dramatic fall, no avalanche, nothing cinematic. Just a long, quiet series of decisions that the mountain was patiently waiting to collect on. Stick around for both, because the second one gets worse than the first. It was June 3, 2018, the West Buttress route, Denali, 14,200 feet. Denali is the coldest mountain on Earth relative to its altitude, sitting far enough north that its summit experiences wind chills that rival Everest's, despite standing nearly 9,000 feet shorter. The National Park Service requires every climber to register weeks in advance and attend a mandatory briefing precisely because Denali's weather windows close without warning, and rescue above 14,000 feet depends entirely on a helicopter that can't fly in the whiteouts that roll in fastest exactly when climbers need it most. Renata Voss was 41, a scheduling director for a national logistics firm out of Denver, the kind of job where her entire professional identity was built around forcing chaotic systems into rigid timelines. She had done 2 guided trips before this, Rainier and Kilimanjaro, and she talked about both of them at dinner parties the way some people talk about degrees. Her Instagram caption from Kilimanjaro read, "When you run the schedule, the mountain runs on time." She had trained hard for Denali. Nothing about that training touched what actually breaks people up there, which isn't fitness, it's patience. What Renata had never learned, in 19 years of forcing other people's calendars to bend to hers, was that a mountain doesn't take a meeting. Her guide was Kayla Reyes, 33, 6 seasons on Denali, 2 Everest summits, known around base camp for an almost supernatural calm that had talked more than one panicking client down off a ledge, physically and emotionally. She'd taken this contract to save for a down payment on a house outside Talkeetna. She told her partner before she left that this was going to be an easy one, an experienced client, small group, good forecast window. She was wrong about exactly one of those things. The first crack showed at base camp, before they'd even flown in. Renata arrived 40 minutes late to the mandatory NPS briefing because she'd been on a work call, and when the ranger paused to let her catch up, she waved a hand and said she'd read the packet. Kayla noted it quietly. It wasn't a crime, it was a preview. By Camp 1, at 7,800 feet, the pattern had a name Kayla just hadn't said out loud yet. Renata complained that the freeze-dried meals were beneath what she was paying for, that the tent assignments felt arbitrary, that another client on the trip, a soft-spoken retired teacher named Judith, was slowing the group down, simply by asking clarifying questions at rest stops. Kayla explained, evenly, that on Denali the group moves at the pace of its slowest safe member, because that's how everyone survives the descent too. Renata said she understood, and then, at the next rest stop, told Judith directly that she should maybe sit this leg out if she couldn't keep up. Judith, to her enormous credit, kept up fine. Renata's math had simply been wrong. She did not apologize. At Camp 2, 11,200 feet, on the steep, exposed traverse below Motorcycle Hill, a slope that has claimed climbers in whiteout conditions because the drop-off to one side is disguised by featureless snow, Renata insisted on unroping during a rest break so she could take photos without looking like part of a chain gang. Kayla told her, in the flattest voice she could manage, that the rope wasn't optional on that section, full stop, regardless of visibility. Renata clipped back in, but muttered that she'd climbed Kili without a babysitter. Kayla noted, silently, that Kilimanjaro is a walk-up with none of Denali's crevasse fields, but she'd learned 6 seasons ago that explaining glaciology to someone determined not to listen was a waste of oxygen she'd need later. The single central refusal came at 14,200 feet, at what climbers call Gene Basin, the last major camp before the summit push, where teams typically cache extra fuel and food in the snow to lighten their loads for the higher, harder sections above. NPS rangers stationed there run a mandatory weather and fitness check before anyone is cleared to continue toward the fixed lines on the head wall. The ranger on duty flagged Renata for early signs of a mild frostnip on 2 fingers from repeatedly removing her gloves for photos and recommended a rest day before continuing. Renata told the ranger she had a return flight booked for 4 days out and didn't have a rest day to give. The ranger noted the exchange in the logbook, unusual for a first offense, but not unprecedented. Kayla backed the ranger fully, and this is the moment the narrator wants you to sit with for a second. An entitled client, a byproduct of a rules-first system finally saying no, and a guide who had absolutely no leverage left to make her listen, because Renata had already made clear 3 separate times that Kayla's job was to accompany her, not to advise her. The institutional complicity here is a little different than usual. There was no company overriding the guide for a good review. It was worse in its own quiet way. Renata simply outranked the room by attitude alone. She had decided, somewhere around Camp 1, that Kayla was hired help in the same category as an Uber driver, someone whose objections were noise to be managed, not information to be used. Kayla tried twice more over the next 2 days to get her to take the rest day. Both times, Renata changed the subject to logistics, pack weights, timing, whether they'd summit before the forecast window closed, treating the conversation as a scheduling problem instead of a medical one. The point of no return happened quietly, the morning of the summit push, June 9th. Renata's frost nip had progressed overnight into what the expedition's medic, a soft-spoken paramedic named Doug Ferris who'd flown up specifically to cover the higher camps, identified as early frostbite on 3 fingers of her right hand, pale, waxy, numb to touch. Doug recommended she descend immediately with an escort. Renata looked at her own hand, flexed the fingers once and said, "They still work. I'll deal with it after." She said it flatly, almost administratively, the way she might have dismissed a minor line item on a budget. Kayla told her this wasn't a line item. Renata was already walking toward the fixed lines. Above 17,200 feet, on the exposed ridge below Denali Pass, a notoriously wind-scoured saddle where gusts regularly exceed 50 miles per hour, and where more Denali deaths have occurred than almost any other single point on the mountain, the frostbite had spread into her hand fully, and Renata's grip on her ice axe had become unreliable enough that Kayla insisted on shortening the rope between them and taking the lead. For the first time in 6 days, Renata didn't argue. She'd stopped talking almost entirely by then, which Kayla, with 6 seasons of pattern recognition, understood immediately as far more dangerous than the arguing had ever been. At 19,400 feet, roughly 900 feet below the true summit, Renata sat down in the snow without warning and said she needed 5 minutes. Kayla checked her pulse oximeter, 71%, severely hypoxic for the altitude, consistent with early high-altitude cerebral edema layering on top of the deepening frostbite. Kayla made the call immediately. No summit, full descent, radio to base camp for a possible short-haul helicopter extraction if the weather held. The weather did not hold. A whiteout rolled in within 40 minutes, grounding any possible air rescue, and Kayla was left doing what 6 seasons on this mountain had trained her for, getting an increasingly confused, increasingly uncooperative client down a fixed line in zero visibility. Alone, because the other 2 clients in the party had already descended a day earlier with a second guide. They made it to 17,200 feet before Renata stopped responding to voice commands entirely. Kayla radioed for support from a nearby NPS ranger patrol, and 2 rangers reached her position within the hour, but a carry-down from that altitude in whiteout conditions took the rest of the day. Renata was pronounced dead at Camp 4, 17,200 feet, at 6:52 p.m. on June 9th. Cause of death listed as HACE, complicated by severe frostbite and exposure. The kind of ending that reads, on paper, like a checklist of every warning she'd waved off individually, stacked one on top of the other, until there was nothing left to wave off. Kayla flew home to Talkeetna 9 days later than planned. She got the house anyway. She still guides Denali every June. She still tells new clients on day 1, evenly and without much emotion, that the rope isn't a suggestion, and that when a guide says rest day, there is no version of a return flight that outranks that sentence. Most of them listen. Renata is the one story she tells when someone doesn't. It was October 14th, 2021. Base camp, Annapurna I, 13,550 feet. Annapurna I carries the highest fatality-to-summit ratio of any mountain over 8,000 meters on Earth. For every 3 climbers who've reached its true summit, roughly 1 has died trying. It's not the altitude alone that does it, it's the terrain. Massive hanging seracs that calve without warning across the standard route, avalanche paths that have swept entire camps off the mountain overnight, and a summit ridge so corniced that experienced guides describe walking it as trusting your weight to something that might not be there. Annapurna doesn't forgive contempt. It especially doesn't forgive contempt for the people whose entire job is reading the mountain's mood before it turns. Priya Anand was 39, the founder and sole owner of a luxury boutique chain across 3 cities, a woman who had built her business on the principle that money bought deference, and who had never, in 15 years of running it, encountered a room where that principle didn't hold. She had climbed Kilimanjaro and Elbrus, both non-technical trade routes, both completed with private guides she'd hand-picked, and, by her own account online, trained to anticipate what I need before I ask. Her application to the expedition company for Annapurna listed her experience honestly. What it couldn't capture was how she treated the people beneath her, which turned out to be the only variable that mattered on this particular mountain. Her guide was Dawa Sherpa, 36, 4 Annapurna summits, a genuinely elite number on a mountain this dangerous, and a reputation among other guides for reading serac movement almost instinctively, the kind of read that comes from having lost friends to the ones he misjudged early in his career. He'd taken this contract specifically because Annapurna contracts pay well, precisely because so few guides are willing to take them repeatedly. He had a son starting university in Kathmandu that fall. This climb was covering the first year's fees outright. The first incident happened at base camp, over food. Priya sent her breakfast back twice through the cook staff, not because anything was wrong with it, witnesses would later say, but because she wanted the eggs plated differently, a request that meant almost nothing at 13,550 feet on a 2-burner camp stove serving 11 people. She then complained to Dawa that the kitchen staff were surly, when in fact they'd simply stopped making conversation with her after the second returned plate. Dawa apologized on their behalf, which cost him nothing and fixed nothing because the actual problem wasn't the eggs. At Camp 1, 16,200 feet, the ladder crossing incident happened, the kind of small, specific cruelty that other guides at base camp would still be talking about a season later. The route to Camp 1 crosses a section of glacier where aluminum ladders bridge narrow crevasses, and climbers wait their turn single file, clipped into a fixed rope, while each person crosses. A young porter named Nima, 19 years old and on his second season, was crossing ahead of Priya's group when he slipped slightly, catching himself on the safety rope without falling. Priya, waiting behind him, said loudly enough for the whole line to hear, "This is why they shouldn't put boys on the ropes." Nima said nothing and kept walking. Dawa, standing close enough to hear it, later told a fellow guide it was the first time in 4 seasons he'd wanted to say something back to a client and physically stopped himself. At Camp 2, 19,500 feet, beneath the looming ice cliffs that give this section of the route its grim nickname among guides, the bowling alley, for how frequently serac fall sweeps straight through the tent sites below, Priya insisted on an extra rest day purely for her own comfort, despite a forecast showing a narrowing weather window. Dawa explained that every day spent in the bowling alley was a day of exposure to falling ice, and that the standard practice was to move through this section as quickly as safely possible, not linger in it. Priya said she'd paid for a 5-star experience, not a race, and stayed in her tent the extra day regardless of what Dawa recommended. Nothing fell that day. It was, in the narrator's plain estimation, luck, not vindication, though Priya would tell people afterward that her instincts had been right. Here's the central refusal, the one point of failure the entire story turns on. At Camp 3, 22,800 feet, with a serac collapse audible in the distance overnight, a sound other climbers on the mountain described as like thunder that doesn't stop. Dawa made the call, alongside 2 other lead guides on the mountain that season, to abandon the summit push entirely and descend. The seismic and visual signs, he explained to Priya directly, suggested the upper icefall was destabilizing faster than the forecast window justified continuing through. Priya refused. She told Dawa she hadn't spent 6 figures and 3 years of planning to turn around because of one guide's gut feeling, and that if he wasn't willing to continue, she'd find someone in camp who was. This is the moment, and there's no way to soften it. She fired him, not formally, not through the company, just directly, to his face. At 22,800 feet, telling him his services were no longer required, and that she'd continue with a Nepali climbing sirdar from a neighboring expedition she'd befriended over the previous week. A competent but far less experienced man named Tenzing who, by his own later account to investigators, felt he couldn't refuse a paying foreign client asking directly for help, even against his own better judgment. Dawa radioed base camp immediately to report the dismissal, exactly as protocol required, and was told, exactly as protocol required, that a client cannot compel a guide's employment against company policy, but also cannot be physically prevented from leaving camp with someone else entirely outside that company's authority. There was, in the plainest terms, nothing anyone at base camp could actually do once Priya walked out of Dawa's tent that morning. She and Tenzing left Camp 3 at 4 a.m. the next day, into conditions that 2 other expeditions on the mountain had already independently decided to sit out. Dawa watched them go from the edge of camp and radioed a position report every hour, the only thing left within his power to do. At 6:40 a.m., roughly 300 vertical feet above Camp 3, a serac the size of a small building calved off the upper icefall without warning, sending a debris avalanche directly across the route Priya and Tenzing were climbing. 2 other guides on a nearby fixed line, roped to a separate expedition, witnessed it from a safe distance and radioed immediately. There was no dramatic rescue attempt to describe, because there was nothing left to rescue toward. The debris field covered the route in a swath nearly 200 meters wide, and neither climber's position was recoverable that day, or, ultimately, at all. Nepal's Mountaineering Department later confirmed both deaths based on witness testimony and the absence of any radio contact following the event, consistent with instantaneous burial. Dawa gave a statement to the department 3 days later, at their request, laying out the timeline plainly, without editorializing. He didn't need to editorialize. The timeline did that on its own. A client who had spent an entire expedition treating expertise as a service she could opt out of when it became inconvenient, opting out of it one final time, at the one moment on the entire mountain where that expertise was the only thing standing between her and the ice above. He flew home to Kathmandu 2 weeks later. His son started university that fall, tuition paid in full. He hasn't spoken publicly about Priya since, except once, to a younger guide who asked him what he'd have done differently. He said there wasn't anything left to do differently by Camp 3. The mistake, he said, had already been made back at breakfast, the first time she decided the people serving her weren't worth listening to. Everything after that was just the mountain finishing a sentence she'd started herself. It was May 29, 2026, at approximately 7:30 a.m. at Camp 4 on Mount Everest's south side. The altitude was 26,000 feet. The temperature was minus 42 degrees Celsius. The oxygen level in the air was approximately 1/3 what it is at sea level. A Sherpa guide named Dawa Sherpa, age 31, was preparing for a final push to the summit with a Polish client. The client was wealthy, experienced in mountaineering, and had paid approximately $95 for his Everest expedition. Dawa had been hired as his personal guide through a commercial expedition operator based in Kathmandu. The arrangement was standard. The client would attempt the summit. The guide would support him. They would descend together, but nothing about what happened over the next 7 days would be standard. Dawa Sherpa had been working as a high-altitude climbing guide for 12 years. He had summited Everest 7 times. He had guided clients on K2O, on Denali, on multiple 8,000ers across the Himalayas and Karakoram. He was experienced, capable, and trusted by the expedition companies that employed him. He was also poor, earning approximately $3, 0 to 70, 5,000 per climbing season for work that regularly exposed him to altitude sickness, exhaustion, and death. His wife was in Kathmandu. His children depended on his income from climbing. He took the work because the alternative was poverty. The Polish client, whose name was not widely publicized in initial reports, was attempting Everest as part of his personal mountaineering goal. He had successfully climbed other high peaks. He had the fitness and the technical skill to attempt Everest. He also had the economic resources to hire a private guide, to purchase supplemental oxygen, to arrange evacuation insurance. Dawa and the Polish client began their summit push on May 29th, moving upward from Camp 4 into the death zone, the altitude above 26,000 feet where the human body is essentially dying, where every moment at that elevation represents cells being destroyed, where the only question is how quickly you can descend to lower altitude before the damage becomes irreversible. The climb proceeded. Dawa was moving well. The Polish client was moving well. They were making good time. The weather was holding. The visibility was decent. Everything seemed to be progressing according to plan. They climbed through the afternoon, through the evening, through the night of May 29, 30. By dawn on May 30th, they were above 27,000 feet. approaching the final push toward the 29,032-foot summit. But at extreme altitude, the human body's responses become unpredictable. The Polish client, despite his fitness and experience, began to experience symptoms of altitude sickness. His breathing became labored. His coordination was declining. His judgment was becoming compromised. Dawa recognized the signs. He had seen them hundreds of times, the body's rebellion against the impossible environment. He suggested turning back. The client refused. He said he could continue. He said the summit was close. He said he wanted to push higher. They continued. By midday on May 30th, they were at approximately 27,500 feet. The Polish client's condition was worsening noticeably. His movements were becoming erratic. His speech was slurring slightly. Dawa was watching him carefully, understanding that his job had shifted from guide to caretaker, from facilitator of summiting to preventer of death. At some point during the afternoon of May 30th, the Polish client made a decision that would alter both their fates. He decided to descend. He told Dawa they were turning around. They were going back down the mountain. The descent from extreme altitude is actually more dangerous than the ascent. The body is more exhausted. The judgment is more compromised. The technical difficulty of moving downward on steep terrain at altitude exceeds the difficulty of moving upward. Dawa and the Polish client began their descent. They moved carefully through the afternoon, and into the evening of May 30th, they were descending through the death zone, moving toward lower altitude where their bodies might have a chance to recover. What happened next is where the story becomes unclear, because Dawa's account and the Polish client's account differ significantly. According to Dawa's later statement to rescue teams and expedition investigators, the Polish client became increasingly disoriented during the descent. His judgment was compromised by altitude sickness. He was making poor decisions about rope placement, about route selection, about when to rest, and when to continue moving. At a certain point, the Polish client, moving faster than Dawa, moving with less caution, moved ahead of Dawa on the descent. He was perhaps 50 meters ahead, moving down the fixed ropes, descending toward Camp 4 and lower altitude. According to Dawa, the Polish client reached a section of the descent and then simply kept going. He passed Camp 4. He continued descending without waiting for Dawa. He descended alone, moving quickly, putting distance between himself and his guide. Dawa, moving more slowly, more carefully, following proper procedure, was left behind. By the time Dawa reached Camp 4, it was evening on May 30th. The Polish client was gone. He had continued descending toward lower camps. He had not waited. He had not left supplies. He had not coordinated a meeting point. He had simply descended and left Dawa at 26,000 feet with minimal gear, no supplemental oxygen, and no immediate plan for rescue. What followed was 7 days of survival at extreme altitude under conditions that medical science suggests should have been fatal within 48 hours. Dawa had some clothing. He had a sleeping bag. He had the remnants of supplies left at Camp 4 by other expeditions. And critically, he had a small amount of food that had been abandoned, some chocolate bars and other items left behind by climbers who had summited and descended days earlier. He had water, which he created by melting ice using a small stove and fuel that was available at the camp. The first night at Camp 4 alone was the beginning of a nightmare that would last a week. Dawa was at 26,000 feet without supplemental oxygen. His body was in active breakdown. His brain was being starved of oxygen. His lungs were likely beginning to accumulate fluid from the altitude-induced pulmonary edema that affects climbers at that height. His core temperature was dropping despite his sleeping bag and clothing. He was conscious of the fact that he was dying slowly, but dying nonetheless. But Dawa did something that kept him alive. He did not panic. He rationed the food he had. He melted ice for water. He stayed in the tent. He conserved his energy. He understood, from years of experience on mountains, that survival at extreme altitude is about minimizing energy expenditure, maintaining hydration, and waiting for rescue. He knew that climbers at lower camps would eventually realize he was missing. He knew that rescue teams would organize. He knew that his only job was to stay alive long enough for help to arrive. On May 31st, Dawa remained at Camp 4. He was alone. His radio had limited battery and limited range. He could not reliably communicate with camps below. His situation was unknown to most of the expedition. The Polish client had descended to lower camps. He reported that he had summited. He did not initially mention that he had abandoned his guide at altitude. By the time other climbers and expedition leaders realized that Dawa was missing, hours had already passed. June 1st, 2-3 passed. Dawa remained at Camp 4. His condition was deteriorating. His oxygen saturation was certainly dropping to critical levels below 50%, approaching the threshold where the brain cannot maintain consciousness. His body temperature was fluctuating. He was eating small amounts of chocolate and ice. He was melting snow for water. He was doing everything possible to maintain the absolute minimum functions required to stay alive. On June 4th, rescue teams from the expedition, coordinating with Sherpa from other camps, reached Camp 4. They found Dawa alive. He was weak, disoriented, suffering from severe altitude sickness and hypothermia, but alive. He had survived 7 days at 26,000 feet without supplemental oxygen, a feat that contradicts much of what medical science understands about human survival at extreme altitude. The rescue was complicated. Dawa could not walk unassisted. His body had been so thoroughly compromised by a week at the death zone that his legs would not support him. He had to be carried, lowered, supported as he descended toward lower camps. By June 5th, he had reached Camp 2 at lower altitude where his body could begin to recover. By June 6th, he was at base camp receiving medical care. The aftermath revealed several critical details. The Polish client had indeed abandoned Dawa deliberately, or at minimum, had made the decision to descend rapidly without ensuring his guide's safety or well-being. The expedition company investigated. They found that the Polish client had violated basic mountaineering ethics, the responsibility of a climber to ensure the safety of guides and teammates. But legally, there was limited recourse. The Polish client had paid his fee. He had reached his goal of attempting to summit Everest. Dawa had survived against extraordinary odds. What makes Dawa's story significant is not just that he survived, though survival at that altitude without oxygen is medically remarkable. What makes it significant is what it reveals about the system. A wealthy client could pay $95, zero to attempt Everest. A guide could risk his life for $3, zero to $5, zero. And when the client abandoned the guide at extreme altitude, there was no mechanism to hold the Igor Tishinsky was born in Ukraine in 1984. He grew up in a country with a strong mountaineering tradition. The Soviet Union had produced some of the world's greatest climbers, and Ukraine had contributed many of them. Igor grew up with mountains in the distance, with stories of climbers who had summited the world's highest peaks. By his early 20s, he had decided that he would join that tradition. He had summited Kilimanjaro at 5,895 meters. He had summited Mount Elbrus at 5,642 meters. He had proven that his body could handle altitude. And now, at 22 years old, he wanted to attempt the ultimate Mount Everest at 8,849 meters. But Igor had an idea that would make his climb different from other climbs. He would document it. He would bring a small digital video camera to Everest and record everything: the journey, the suffering, the triumph. This was 2006, before GoPro cameras existed, before action cams were standard mountaineering equipment. Most climbers didn't film. The few who did usually had professional film crews. Igor was planning to do it alone with basic equipment, documenting his own experience in real time. He wanted to show the world what Everest actually looked like, what it actually felt like, what it actually cost. In April 2006, Igor arrived at Everest Base Camp on the north side in Tibet. Base camp sits at 5,364 meters, and even at that altitude, climbers experience the beginning of altitude sickness. Headaches, nausea, shortness of breath. Igor started filming immediately. His first videos showed the base camp sprawling across the Rongbuk Glacier, hundreds of tents, dozens of expeditions, climbers from around the world, all converging on the same mountain. He filmed the Sherpa porters preparing loads. He filmed the prayer flags that Buddhist climbers had hung. He filmed the sunrise hitting the north face of Everest, casting long shadows across the ice. Igor Igor's expedition was a small operation, just Igor and two Sherpa guides named Pemba and Dorje. They had hired a local operator to organize logistics. The plan was straightforward: acclimatize through April, attempt the summit in May during the weather window, descend, and return to Tibet. Igor would film the entire process. His camera would be his constant companion. The first rotation took the three of them from base camp to Camp 1 at 6,400 meters. Igor filmed the walk across the Rongbuk Glacier, the crevasses they crossed, the fixed ropes they used. His footage showed the technical challenges of the approach, nothing catastrophic, but constant exposure. He filmed Pemba and Dorje working, moving with the efficiency that comes from decades of experience. He filmed himself struggling, breathing heavily, moving slowly. The altitude was already affecting him noticeably. By late April, Igor was at Camp 2 at 6,500 meters. The footage from this point showed him becoming quieter, less energetic. He was experiencing real altitude sickness, not the mild kind that acclimatization cures, but the kind that compounds with time. And height. His face in the videos was paler. His movements were slower. Pemba and Dorje were watching him carefully now. They were discussing whether he should continue. Igor insisted he wanted to push higher. He had come too far to turn back. He had invested too much time and money. He had promised people back in Ukraine that he would summit. By May 10th, Igor was at Camp 3 at 7,500 meters. The footage from this altitude showed something changing in Igor's demeanor. His speech was slurring slightly. His movements were becoming uncoordinated. His brain was being starved of oxygen. Pemba suggested descending. Igor refused. He said he felt okay. He said the summit was close. He said he could make it. What he didn't realize was that his brain, the organ responsible for accurate self-assessment, was the same organ that was being destroyed by the lack of oxygen. His judgment was compromised by the very condition killing him. On May 15th, Igor and his guides left Camp 4, which sits at 8,200 meters, for the final push toward the summit. The plan was to summit on May 16th and descend the same day, but the climb took longer than expected. Igor was moving slowly. His body was not cooperating with his will. His guides had to stop frequently, had to help him move from one section to the next. By the time afternoon arrived, Igor's oxygen saturation had dropped to dangerous levels. His breathing was labored. His movements were becoming erratic. At approximately 5 p.m. on May 15th, at around 8,400 meters on the north face, Igor's body began to fail completely. His Sherpa guides realized what was happening. They were witnessing high-altitude cerebral edema HACE, where the brain swells from lack of oxygen. Igor's behavior had become confused. He was hallucinating slightly. He was not responding appropriately to instructions. Pemba was trying to get him to descend. Igor was resisting. He wanted to keep climbing. His brain was no longer capable of understanding that keeping climbing meant dying. And this is where Igor's footage becomes uniquely important. Despite his condition, Igor continued to hold his camera and film. His later videos show him moving unsteadily, moving toward higher altitude despite his guide's protests. The footage is shaky, disorienting, difficult to watch, but it is also a real-time documentation of cerebral edema progression. His speech becomes increasingly incoherent. His movements become increasingly erratic. His decision-making becomes increasingly irrational. This is what extreme altitude does to the human brain. By 8 p.m. on May 15th, Igor could no longer stand unsupported. His guides were essentially carrying him down the mountain. Now, the footage shows them holding him, moving him, trying to get him to lower altitude where his brain might have a chance to recover. But they were at 8,400 meters in the dark. The temperature was minus 40 degrees Celsius. Igor's core temperature was dropping. His brain was swelling. His lungs were probably filling with fluid from the altitude-induced pulmonary edema that often accompanies cerebral edema. At approximately 9:47 p.m. on May 15th, Igor Tushinsky died. He was 22 years old. He had been filming his own death for several hours without fully comprehending that he was dying. His guides descended with his body through the night, moving as fast as the darkness and terrain allowed. By morning, Igor's body was secured at a lower camp. His camera, recovered from his pack, contained the footage of his final hours. What makes Igor's death medically significant is that his footage provides visual documentation of HACE progression that rarely exists. Most climbers who develop severe cerebral edema either die before anyone thinks to document it, or they survive and can only describe their symptoms verbally afterward. Igor's video shows the actual physical progression of brain swelling at extreme altitude, the confusion, the lack of coordination, the inability to make rational decisions, the body's complete failure of basic functions. His footage has been studied by high-altitude medicine researchers. It has been shown in training courses for mountain guides. It has become part of the medical literature on what extreme altitude does to the human brain. Igor Tyszynski wanted to document Everest. Instead, he left behind documentation of human mortality. I'm Isaac from the Mountain Takes. Igor Tyszynski was 22 years old. He wanted to show the world what Everest actually meant. He did, but not in the way he intended. His footage showed the mountain's absolute indifference to human ambition, human will, human dreams. If you've ever wondered what happens to the brain at extreme altitude, if you've ever questioned whether willpower alone can overcome the physics of oxygen deprivation, Igor's footage is the answer. Subscribe, because there are more stories of mountains that document their own victims. I'll see you on the next descent.
It was April 9th, 2019. Everest Base Camp, 17,600 feet. Everest kills in ways that have nothing to do with fitness. Above 26,000 feet lies the death zone, where the air holds barely a third of the oxygen found at sea level, where the body begins consuming itself just to keep the brain functioning. More than 300 people have died on this mountain since records began, and a disproportionate number of them died not from lack of skill, but from a decision made somewhere between Camp 2 and Camp 4, when judgment was already the first thing the altitude took. Dana Whitfield was 44 years old, a management consultant from Charlotte, North Carolina, who had spent 19 years telling companies how to restructure themselves around efficiency. She had summited Aconcagua and Denali in the 3 years prior, and she carried both climbs like credentials, the way she carried her firm's name on a business card. Her Instagram bio read, "Peak performance, on mountains and in the boardroom." She had trained for 14 months for Everest, a nutritionist, an altitude tent in her spare bedroom, a climbing coach twice a week. Nothing prepared her for this. What Dana had never done was defer. In 19 years of consulting, she had built a career on walking into rooms where she knew less than anyone else in them, and leaving with everyone doing what she said. She assumed the mountain worked the same way, that authority was a posture you took, not something the terrain itself decided to grant or withhold. Her guide was Pemba Sherpa, 38, with 11 Everest summits behind him and 15 years guiding on the mountain. He was known at base camp for being quiet, meticulous, and almost unnervingly calm, the kind of guide other guides sent difficult clients to. He had 2 daughters in Kathmandu, and this season's contract was paying for their school fees 3 years running. He'd told his wife before he left that this would be his last big season. He wanted to be around for saving one more decision from becoming a mistake, and then be done. At base camp, the first friction surfaced during rotation planning. Pemba recommended an extra day at Camp 2 for acclimatization, standard practice for a first-time 8,000-meter climber. Dana said her Denali summit meant she didn't need training wheels. Pemba explained, gently, that Denali and Everest stressed the body in different ways, that the death zone above 8,000 meters had nothing comparable on Denali. Dana smiled and said she appreciated his caution, but she'd made her decision. Pemba noted it and let it go. The narrator would tell you now, this was the first quiet withdrawal, though nobody at camp could have named it yet. By Camp 2, at 21,300 feet, the pattern had a shape. Dana had started second-guessing Pemba's calls on pace, insisting they were moving too slowly through the western Qum, a valley climbers call the Valley of Silence, for the way sound seems to vanish into the surrounding walls of ice, and for how still the air goes on windless days. Pemba flagged her SpO2 reading at 81%, low for the altitude, not dangerous yet, but a signal. Dana waved off the pulse oximeter. "I feel fine," she said.
Pemba wrote the number down anyway. At Camp 3, 23,600 feet, on the Lhotse face, an 1,800-foot wall of blue glacial ice, so steep that climbers fix ropes the entire way up it, because a single slip here has historically been fatal. Dana told Pemba she wanted to skip the second rotation back down to Camp 2 that most climbers use to acclimatize before summit push. Pemba explained the physiology as simply as he could. The body needs to touch altitude, retreat, and rebuild red blood cells before going higher, or the summit push becomes a race against a body that hasn't caught up. Dana told him she'd read the same articles he had, and that on Denali, she'd skipped a rotation and been fine. Pemba said Denali tops out at just over 20,000 feet. Dana said she'd made her decision. The narrator flags it here plainly. She was arguing physiology with a man who had 11 summits, based on a mountain half this one's height. The institutional complicity arrived at Camp 2, 3 days before the summit push. Dana radioed the expedition company's base camp manager directly, bypassing Pemba, to request a pace change and a different oxygen flow rate than Pemba had set. The base camp manager, aware Dana's firm had paid a premium rate and had already left a 5-star review of the company mid-expedition, a rare, valuable thing for future bookings, approved her request without consulting Pemba. Pemba found out only when Dana told him herself, almost cheerfully. He said nothing that night, but the following morning he asked the base camp manager, quietly and once, to route all future changes through him first. The manager said he would. He didn't. The summit push began the night of May 22nd, from the South Col at 26,000 feet, in temperatures near -30 degrees Fahrenheit, with a route that funnels climbers through the balcony, the South Summit, the Hillary Step, and then a final exposed ridge to the top, each section requiring hours of fixed rope traffic in single file, often in the dark, often in a queue. Above the South Col there is no real rescue. Above 26,000 feet, helicopters cannot safely operate, and a climber in trouble is, for practical purposes, dependent entirely on the people physically standing next to them. At the balcony, 27,600 feet, Dana's oxygen flow rate, set by her own request, not Pemba's, was running lean, calibrated for a longer summit day than her actual pace was achieving. Pemba noticed her gait had slowed and her speech had thinned to short phrases. He suggested increasing her flow rate and turning back if it didn't improve within the hour. Dana told him, in a voice 2 other climbers on the rope behind her would later describe to investigators as flat but certain, that she hadn't spent 14 months training to turn around 800 feet from the top. Pemba said the mountain would still be there next year. Dana said she wouldn't be back next year, and he was welcome to descend alone if he'd lost his nerve. This was the point of no return, and it did not look dramatic. There was no shouting on that ridge. Dana simply unclipped her second carabiner from the fixed line where Pemba had asked her to double protect through an exposed section, looked at him, and clipped past him instead, taking the lead position on the rope for the first time all summit night. She said, "I don't need a babysitter above 8,000 meters." She said it once, and then, 20 minutes later, almost identically again, as if convincing herself. Pemba followed her, but no longer led. Near the south summit, 28,700 feet, with dawn breaking pink over the Kangshung face, Dana told Pemba she was releasing him from the summit push, that she'd radioed down that he'd been let go for excessive caution, and that she'd finish the final 500 feet with the queue of climbers ahead of her instead. Pemba radioed base camp immediately to report it. The manager told him company policy required him to stay with the client regardless of her instructions. Dana, overhearing the radio call on the shared channel, unclipped fully from Pemba's rope team and moved forward into the traffic line alone, telling 2 Indian climbers ahead of her that her guide had been reassigned. Sunita Rao, 34, a climber from Mumbai 2 positions ahead of Dana in the queue, would later tell investigators that Dana seemed lucid enough to speak in full sentences at that point, which was itself part of what made no one intervene. She didn't look confused, she looked determined. A second witness, Expedition Dr. Mark Feldman, stationed at the South Col, confirmed by radio log that Dana's oxygen mask readout, relayed by a nearby climber's radio, showed her tank pressure dropping faster than her flow rate setting should have allowed, suggesting either a regulator fault or a rate she'd altered again herself without telling anyone. At 8:40 a.m., near the base of the Hillary Step, at roughly 28,940 feet, Dana stopped moving in the queue. Climbers behind her assumed she was resting, as people often do in the traffic line at that altitude. It was 11 minutes before anyone realized she hadn't moved at all. Pemba, descending from where he'd last seen her, reached her position at 9:52 a.m., Her SpO2, when he finally got a reading, showed 58%. Her lips had gone the dull blue-gray of cyanosis. She was unresponsive to voice and to a sternal rub. Pemba administered supplemental oxygen at maximum flow and radioed for the closest available climbers to assist a carry-down, but above 28,000 feet a carry-down for an unresponsive adult is, in practical terms, nearly impossible. There is no evacuation above the death zone that doesn't risk the lives of everyone attempting it. 2 Sherpas from another team arrived to help within 20 minutes. Dana was pronounced dead at 11:15 a.m., later listed as high-altitude cerebral edema compounded by hypoxia, consistent with an oxygen flow rate insufficient for her actual exertion and altitude. They left a small trekking pole marker near where she was found, a quiet, unofficial custom on a mountain where full recovery is rarely possible. Pemba carried her ice axe down himself and gave it to her sister at base camp 8 days later. He didn't say much when he handed it over. He didn't need to. Dana had spent 19 years being right about rooms full of people who didn't know as much as she did. Everest was the first room that didn't care.